Hi there, welcome to Fantasy Hub. I'm Mia, your storyteller. Today's story is filled with heartache, discovery, and a twist you won't see coming. So let's begin.
It was 3 days after the Morrison trial ended. 3 days of restless nights, replaying every objection, every sustained ruling, every moment when Judge Chelsea Hartwell's dark eyes met mine across that courtroom. I told myself I was going to the Legal Eagle bookstore to research precedents for my next case. That's what I wrote in my calendar. Research, tort law. But honestly, I was hoping to see her. The bookstore smelled like old leather and fresh coffee, that particular scent that made every lawyer in the city feel at home. I was pretending to study a volume on personal injury law when I heard her voice behind me. Looking for loopholes, counselor? My heart did this stupid little skip. I turned around, and there she was, Chelsea Hartwell, out of her judicial robes, wearing jeans and a soft gray sweater that made her look ... approachable, human, dangerous. Just expanding my knowledge base, Your Honor, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. She laughed, this low, warm sound that I'd never heard in her courtroom. It's Chelsea here. No robes, no gavel, no formalities. We ended up at the coffee counter, and what started as small talk about recent Supreme Court decisions somehow turned into a heated debate about Roe v. Wade. She argued with passion, intelligence, fire, everything I glimpsed but never fully seen during her careful judicial restraint. Her cheeks flushed when she made a particularly strong point, and I found myself leaning closer, drawn in by the way her eyes lit up when she spoke about justice and interpretation. You're not what I expected, I admitted somewhere between her second espresso and my third. What did you expect? Ice Queen. All that hanging judge reputation. Her smile was sly. Who says I'm not? Maybe I just choose my moments to thaw. By the time they announced closing, we'd moved from constitutional law to personal philosophy, from legal theory to shared stories about why we'd chosen law in the first place. Her lipstick had faded from our coffee cups and animated conversations, and every one of my professional objections to this, whatever this was, had been thoroughly overruled by the woman sitting across from me. Walk me to my car, she asked. In the parking lot, under the streetlights, she turned to face me. The air between us crackled with everything we weren't saying. Gabriella, she said, my name soft on her lips. This is complicated. I know. We can't, I know. She stepped closer anyway. So did I. The kiss was gentle at first, questioning. Then I felt her fingers tangle in my hair, and suddenly it wasn't gentle anymore. It was months of courtroom tension and professional restraint. And God, the way she'd looked at me during the Morrison closing arguments, all of it poured into this moment under the flickering streetlight. When we broke apart, we were both breathing hard. This is a terrible idea, she whispered against my lips. Absolutely terrible, I agreed, and kissed her again. What followed were weeks of the most exhilarating and terrifying experiences of my life. We texted late into the night, careful coded messages at first, then bolder ones as we grew drunk on the thrill of our secret. Reviewing briefs late tonight, I'd text. Careful with your briefs, counselor. Some require special handling, she'd reply. The innuendo was juvenile, but God help me, it made my pulse race every time my phone buzzed. One particularly reckless evening, after a challenging day in court, not her court, thankfully I sent her a photo of my bare shoulder, the phone capturing the curve where my silk blouse had slipped down. Her response came immediately. Counselor, you're in contempt. What's my sentence? I typed back, my hand shaking slightly. I'll let you know when I decide. The next morning, everything changed. I walked into my office to find a message waiting. Judge Hartwell had recused herself from the Maxwell appeal, my biggest case, the one I'd been preparing for months, the case that could make my career. My assistant Jenny knocked on my door. Within the hour. "Everyone's talking about the Hartwell recusal," she said carefully. "Any idea why?" I kept my expression neutral, but inside I was spiraling. The legal community in our city was small, tight-knit. People noticed when a judge suddenly stepped away from a high-profile case without explanation. "Judicial discretion," I said. "Happens all the time." But we both knew it didn't. Not like this. The first article appeared in the Legal Tribune a week later. Just a small gossip column item. Sources suggest Judge Hartwell's recent recusal may have personal rather than professional motivations. Then the whispers started in earnest. I heard them in the courthouse hallways, saw the raised eyebrows when I entered the lawyer's lounge, felt the weight of speculation every time I appeared in any courtroom. The gossip mill was churning, and Chelsea and I were caught in its gears. Meanwhile, our stolen moments became more desperate, more dangerous. There was the afternoon she pulled me into her chambers after court hours, pressing me against her bookshelf as she kissed me like she was trying to memorize the taste of my lips. My stilettos hooked around the legs of her desk chair as she whispered, my name like a prayer. There was the evening we met at her apartment, and I arrived to find her judicial robe draped over a chair so carelessly domestic, so absolutely forbidden. I traced the fabric with trembling fingers while she watched from the doorway. "Do you know what you're doing to me?" she asked, her voice rough. "The same thing you're doing to me," I replied. We were playing with fire, and we both knew it. But the heat was addictive. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. A court clerk someone I'd known for years approached me during lunch recess. "Gabriella," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "You need to know, there's talk about you and Judge Hartwell." Real talk. Someone leaked something to the press. My blood ran cold. What kind of something? He looked uncomfortable. "Photos. Someone saw you leaving her building multiple times." That evening's Evening Herald ran with the headline, "Is the hanging judge sleeping with the prosecution?" They didn't name me directly. They were too careful for that, but anyone in the legal community would know exactly who they meant. City's most prominent prosecutor, recently assigned to major cases in Hartwell's court, recently seen in the judge's neighborhood. My phone rang immediately. Chelsea's voice was steady, but I could hear the steel beneath it. "We need to talk. My place, now." The summons came 2 days later. Official letterhead, formal language, terrifying implications. The Legal Ethics Committee requested our presence at a hearing regarding potential conflicts of interest and violations of judicial conduct. I sat in that sterile conference room, facing a panel of my peers and superiors, trying to keep my hands from shaking. Chairman Reeves, a man I'd respected for years, steepled his fingers and looked at us with disappointment that cut deeper than anger would have. "This is precisely why we have these rules," he said. "The judiciary's integrity depends on the appearance of impartiality as much as actual impartiality." Chelsea sat beside me, her posture perfect, her face unreadable. But under the conference table, her hand found mine, fingers interlacing in a grip that was the only thing keeping me from completely falling apart. They questioned us for hours, professional relationships, timeline of involvement, whether any cases had been compromised, whether we understood the gravity of the situation. "Judge Hartwell," Reeves said finally, "you recused yourself from the Maxwell case. Why?" "To avoid any appearance of impropriety," she answered coolly. But the appearance was already there, wasn't it? The relationship had already begun. Chelsea's grip on my hand tightened almost imperceptibly. The relationship began after the case was assigned. I recused myself the moment I realized the potential for conflict, and yet you continued the relationship. Silence stretched between us like a taut wire. "Yes," she said finally, "I did. We left that hearing knowing our careers hung in the balance. The committee would deliberate, issue recommendations, potentially end everything we'd worked for. That night, we fought. "You should have told me you were presiding over the Maxwell appeal," I shouted, pacing her living room like a caged animal. Before any of this started, Chelsea stood by her fireplace, arms crossed, maddeningly calm. "And you should have asked before you crawled into my bed." The words hit like a slap, cold, calculating, designed to hurt. "Is that what you think this is?" I whirled to face her. "Some kind of calculated seduction? You think I planned this?" "Didn't you?" Her voice was dangerously quiet. "Show up at the bookstore. Convenient coincidence that you just happened to be researching tort law." I started to deny it, then stopped. Because she was right, wasn't she? I had gone there, hoping to see her. I had made that first move, that first choice to blur the lines. "That's what I thought," she said. We stood there, staring at each other across her elegant living room, the space between us feeling like miles instead of feet. Everything we'd built, everything we'd risked, it was crumbling, and I didn't know how to stop it. Then something shifted in her expression. The mask slipped, and I saw the fear beneath it, fear that mirrored my own. "Chelsea," I said softly. She closed her eyes. "I'm sorry." I didn't mean. I crossed the room in 3 steps and kissed her. Hard, desperate, tasting the salt of tears I didn't realize I'd been crying. She kissed me back like she was drowning, her carefully maintained composure finally breaking. "I'm scared," she whispered against my lips. "I know, me too. I've never risked everything for someone before." "Neither have I." She pulled back to look at me, her hands framing my face. "What are we going to do?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But we figure it out together." It was war and surrender all. At once, the acknowledgement that we were in this together, whatever came next. The ethics committee leaked their preliminary findings to the press. Before they delivered their official recommendation to us, the headline screamed from every news website: "Ethics Committee finds serious violations in Hartwell Mitchell case." They were going to recommend Chelsea's removal from the bench. My law license would be suspended pending further review. Years of education, training, dedication gone. That's when Chelsea made a decision that changed everything. She called a press conference. I begged her not to do it. "Let our lawyers handle this. Let them spin it, find precedents, buy us time." But she was done with half measures and careful. Politics. The courthouse steps were swarmed with reporters, cameras, microphones. I stood behind her, barely visible, but present a choice in itself. My presence said everything about where I stood. Chelsea approached the podium with the same confidence she brought to her courtroom. The morning sun caught the auburn highlights in her hair, and she looked every inch the judge she'd trained to be. "I've called this press conference to address recent speculation about my personal life," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd. "Yes, I am romantically involved with prosecutor Gabriella Mitchell. Yes, we began our relationship while she had cases that could potentially come before my court. No, this relationship never influenced my judicial decisions." The crowd erupted in questions, camera flashes creating a strobe effect. She waited for quiet. I recused myself from any case involving Miss Mitchell the moment I realized the potential for conflict. I have maintained the highest ethical standards in my judicial duties throughout our relationship. Someone shouted from the crowd, "Judge Hartwell, are you admitting to an ethics violation?" She paused, and I held my breath. "I'm admitting to falling in love," she said simply. "And if that's incompatible with serving on this bench, then I resign." The word resign hit me like a physical blow. She was throwing away everything, her position, her reputation, her life's work, for me, for us. I don't remember moving. One moment I was behind her, The next, I was stepping up to the microphone. Like hell you do, I heard myself say. And then in front of every news outlet in the state, every legal professional who'd ever known us, every person who judged us, I kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It wasn't romantic or soft or any of the things you see in movies. It was defiant. It was a declaration. It was me saying, loud and clear, that I wasn't ashamed of loving this woman, and I wasn't going to let her sacrifice everything alone. The crowd went wild. Cameras flashed like lightning. I could hear reporters shouting questions, but all I could focus on was Chelsea's eyes when we broke apart, wide with surprise and something that looked like hope. The legal community, it turned out, was more progressive than either of us had expected. Within hours of our press conference, statements of support began pouring in. The State Bar Association issued a carefully worded statement about evolving standards and personal relationships that don't compromise professional integrity. 3 retired judges wrote op-eds defending Chelsea's record and questioning whether love should be grounds for removal. The most surprising support came from an unexpected source, the victims' rights organization I'd worked with on the Morrison case. They issued a statement saying that my personal life was irrelevant to my professional competence, and they continued to have full confidence in my abilities as a prosecutor. Public opinion, surprisingly, seemed to be on our side. Social media, lit up with #love wins hashtags. Editorial writers praised our honesty and transparency. One columnist wrote, in an era of political scandals and judicial corruption, perhaps the most shocking thing about the Hartwell-Mitchell situation is that 2 legal professionals fell in love and handled it ethically. But the ethics committee still had to make their official ruling. We waited 3 weeks. 3 weeks of legal limbo, of not knowing whether we'd have careers to go back to, of living in the strange space between our old lives and whatever came next. Chelsea spent those weeks consulting with lawyers, reviewing precedents, preparing for the worst. But she also spent them doing something I'd never seen before, relaxing. Without the weight of the bench, without the constant scrutiny of judicial propriety, she seemed lighter somehow. She laughed more, touched me more freely, cooked elaborate dinners just because she could. I forgot how much I loved cooking, she said one evening, flour in her hair from an ambitious pasta-making project. When did you stop? When I became a judge. No time for hobbies when you're trying to prove you belong on the bench. I watched. Her roll-out dough with practiced efficiency, and something clicked into place. You're not going back, are you? Even if they clear you. She looked up, surprised. What makes you say that? You're different, happier. She set down the rolling pin and really looked at me. Would that bother you if I didn't go back? No, I realized, it wouldn't. As long as you're making the choice for yourself, not because of me. What if it's both? The ethics committee's ruling came on a Thursday. They cleared us both of any violations that would result in sanctions. Chelsea's recusal was deemed appropriate and timely. My professional conduct was found to be within acceptable bounds. But Chelsea had already made her choice. Ethics with Empathy was Chelsea's idea, a legal consulting firm specializing in helping other legal professionals navigate ethical dilemmas with both integrity and humanity. She'd trade her judicial robes for the freedom to choose her cases, her clients, her schedule. You're sure? I asked her the night before she submitted her resignation. We were lying in bed, my head on her chest, listening to her heartbeat steady and strong beneath my ear. I've been a judge for 8 years, she said, her fingers tracing patterns on my shoulder. I became a judge because I wanted to make a difference, to ensure justice was served fairly, but somewhere along the way, it became about the position itself, about maintaining the image of impartiality even when it meant sacrificing my humanity. You were a good judge, I was, but I'm going to be a better consultant and a better partner. The word sent a warm flutter through my chest. I love you, I said into the darkness. I love you too, she replied. Enough to risk everything? Apparently. Was it worth it? She was quiet for so long, I thought she'd fallen asleep, then asked me again in 50 years. 1 year later, we were back at the Legal Eagle. Same bookstore, same coffee counter, same corner where we'd first really talked, but everything was different. Chelsea wore civilian clothes now, no more judicial robes, no more need to maintain that careful distance from the world. She'd been right about consulting. Ethics with empathy was thriving, and she was happier than I'd ever seen her. I was still prosecuting, but with more flexibility now. I'd turned down the offered promotion to district attorney, choosing instead to focus on cases that mattered to me personally. The Maxwell appeal had been successful, by the way, handled by another prosecutor, but built on the foundation I'd laid. Justice served, careers intact. We'd been browsing the new releases when Chelsea suddenly got down on one knee between the criminal law and romance sections. The ring was simple, a single stone, elegant and understated. Perfect. Gabriella Mitchell, she said, and her voice carried that same confidence she'd once brought to her courtroom, but warmer now, more personal. I have a question for the court. I laughed despite the tears that were suddenly blurring my vision. Counsel, you may proceed. Will you marry me? The bookstore went silent around us. The barista stopped grinding coffee. Other customers turned to stare. Even the elderly man reading legal journals in the corner looked up with interest. Objection? Chelsea asked, grinning up at me. I thought of all the objections I could make. Logistics, where would we live? Professionally, would people still question our integrity? Personally, was I ready to promise forever to someone who'd already turned my life upside down once? But looking down at her, seeing the hope and love and slight nervousness in her eyes, there was only one answer. Overruled, I said, and the word came out like laughter, like joy, like the sound of a life clicking into place. The bookstore erupted in applause. The barista whooped. Someone started recording on their phone. And my Chelsea slipped the ring onto my finger with hands that shook just slightly. The court recognizes this union, she whispered as she stood, and then she was kissing me, and I was kissing her back, and somewhere in the background I heard the elderly man with the legal journals say, well, that's a first. They had our wedding at the courthouse, not because we had to, but because we wanted to. The same building where we'd first locked eyes across a courtroom, where we'd faced the ethics committee, where we'd weathered the storm of professional and personal judgment. Judge Martinez, Chelsea's former colleague and friend, performed the ceremony. Our vows were simple, honest, free of legal jargon, but full of the kind of truth that matters most. I promise to love you in contempt of court, I said, and everyone laughed. I promise to overrule every objection to our happiness, Chelsea replied. 6 months later, I found her in her home office, working late on a particularly complex ethics case. There was a photo on her desk I hadn't seen before us at the bookstore, the moment right after she'd proposed, both of us laughing and crying, and looking like people who'd found exactly what they'd been searching for. Any regrets? I asked, leaning against the doorframe. She looked up from her files, reading glasses perched on her nose, hair falling loose from its professional twist. She looked like the judge she'd been and the woman she was now, all at once. Just one, she said. My heart skipped, just for a moment. I should have kissed you in that courtroom months earlier. I crossed the room and settled onto her lap, her arms coming around me automatically. That would have been quite the scandal. We managed to create enough scandal anyway. True. I traced the line of her jaw with one finger, Any second thoughts about leaving the bench? None. You? None. And I meant it. We'd both given up versions of ourselves to become who we were together. The prosecutor who'd learned that some victories were worth more than career advancement. The judge who discovered that justice meant more than judicial robes and careful impartiality. Some people called our story a cautionary tale about professional ethics. Others called it a romance. I just call it ours. Because here's what I learned. Love isn't a verdict you reach through careful deliberation. It's not a case you build methodically, piece by piece. Sometimes love is an objection that gets overruled by something bigger than logic. Something that makes you willing to risk everything you thought you wanted for something you never knew you needed. Sometimes the most important decisions we make are the ones that seem the most reckless at the time. As for that photo on Chelsea's desk, the one of us laughing in the bookstore, surprised by our own courage, she had it framed with a small plaque underneath. It reads, "The court's final judgment, love wins." And honestly, I couldn't have said it better myself.